Hi, Sam here from Roberts Geospatial. I've started work on the third tier of the ProRaster product family, which is ProRaster Scientific. And one of the major themes in that product will be making it easy for non-expert people to get into satellite multispectral data, both the rendering of that data and the analysis of that data. We'll focus firstly on Landsat and Sentinel-2. And one of the real issues with Landsat in particular is coming to grips with all of the pre-processing that's required to go from a downloaded Landsat scene to data that's suitable for either rendering or some kind of analysis. So I'm trying to come to grips with this, and I thought I'd share some of my thoughts with you today in this video. So let's look at Landsat pre-processing. So firstly, just a list of resources. So there's a paper floating around on the internet, and you can go search for it. It's called A Survival Guide to Landsat Pre-Processing. And that's got some really useful thoughts in it, and I'll be drawing from that paper for this presentation today, a few images and so forth. But a lot of what the conclusions that they came to, I came to similar conclusions. So I think that's a really valuable resource. And then just some links there, the National Land Imaging Program for the USGS, and then you'll find the Landsat missions page. NASA also has a Landsat page. Earth Explorer is where you go to download your Landsat scenes. And then a couple of other links there. There's a couple of applications, web applications, Landsat Look, and there's one from ArcGIS called Landsat Explorer. These things allow you to explore Landsat data. Very, very handy. If you want to go and find a scene, they're a very useful tool to help you find suitable scenes that you want to download for processing. Okay, so here's an image showing you all the Landsat satellites. And they're split into sort of 3 generations, and the way that I divide them is a bit different to the way that other people divide them. But anyway, so we have Landsat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Landsat 6 failed at launch, then Landsat 7, Landsat 8, and then Landsat 9. So Landsat 9 has been launched, was launched I think late last year, and Landsat 9 data is now available. So the first generation was Landsat 1, 2 and 3, and of course those satellites have long since ceased to function. The second generation, in my view, was Landsat 4 and 5. Landsat 5 operated for a long time, but they've now both ceased to operate as well. And then the third generation, in my view, is Landsat 7, 8 and 9. And there are plans for a 10th Landsat. I think it's currently called Landsat Next, which might launch sometime around 2030. So from the user's perspective, what data do you want to download? Well, Landsat 1, 2 and 3 only had an MSS instrument. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And it's not really compatible with the current Landsat data, the Landsat 8 and 9 and 7. So Landsats 4 and 5 and onwards have a modern instrument in them, and so you'll get data which is useful from a modern perspective. Landsat 7, I think, has been compromised for a long time, and it has an instrument problem. And for quite some time, I think since 2008, it hasn't worked properly. It's still returning data, but that's not great. And I think Landsat 7 now is being decommissioned. So what about Landsat 9? Well, Landsat 9's the latest. Data is now available. We'll have a look at some in a minute. I don't know whether Landsat 9 is really ready yet for consumption. If you poke around on the website, you'll find some news. So, for example, they intend to reprocess all of the Landsat 9 scenes at the end of 2022. There have been calibration updates during, it's in its first year of operation, so there are calibration updates going on. I don't think Landsat 9 is the gold standard as yet. I think the gold standard at the present time is Landsat 8. It's definitely a long way ahead of Landsat 7. So until Landsat 9 really gets bedded down, I think Landsat 8 is the best place to go for the best data. So here's the instruments, and this is taken from the paper that I talked about earlier. So Landsat 1 through to 5 had an MSS instrument, and you can see it here. You can see it doesn't have a blue band, it just has green, red, and these near-infrared bands. So that's not what you'd call sort of a modern instrument. The modern instrument began with this with the TM, the enhanced TM, and then the OLI instrument. So Landsat 4 to 5 have a TM instrument, so there's got a wider selection of bands. And then Landsat 7 enhanced that with panchromatic band. So this is when the pan band appeared, and you can see that the pan band is a higher resolution than the other bands. And so you can use pan both for rendering to see higher resolution data, or you can use it to pan sharpen your other spectral data to improve the resolution of that data. So that came in Landsat 7. Landsat 8 has additional bands, and Landsat 9 is the same, although Landsat 9 has some other improvements over Landsat 8. So eventually, Landsat 9 should be a superior instrument to Landsat 8. You can see the pixel sizes here, mostly 30 meters, 15 meters for panchromatic. In fact, some of these bands are not at 30 meters at all. The cell sizes are quite different, so it's all been resampled down to a standard pixel size. And I guess that resampling occurs, multiple times because the data has to be essentially reprojected and then has to be resampled in order to get to the standard sampling size. In each of those processing operations, you can expect the data to be somewhat compromised. So let's go to the next slide. So this is where it kind of gets confusing, the delivery of your Landsat data. So firstly, data is delivered by collection, and then by tier, and then by level. So what's a collection? Well, it's just a different generation of processing that's applied to the Landsat data. So we'll have a look at the processing in a minute, but there's a whole bunch of steps that we have to go through to process the data, and over the years they've improved those processing techniques. So on the website these days you'll see collection 1 and collection 2. There was also pre-collection data, and you can't download that anymore, but you might have some sitting on your server or on your hard disk. I certainly do. So that was the old format. Then they went to collection 1, and data is still downloadable in collection 1, but that will cease at the end of 2022. And now data is being issued in collection 2. So you want to target collection 2 if you possibly can, because that's the most modern data, and pretty soon you won't be able to target these other collections because they won't be downloadable anymore. Just one note, if you're looking at different scenes, NASA do recommend, or USGS do recommend, that you use data from the same collection, because it's got different processing operations applied to it, so it may not be perfectly compatible across different collections. Okay, so you want collection 2 data. Then you look at the tiers. There's tier 1, tier 2, and real time. So tier 1 is what you want. That's high quality data, being processed, ready to go. Scenes that are put into tier 2 may have some problems with their processing. There may be some geometrical problems, or they may be significantly compromised by cloud. In any regard, Tier 2 is probably not data that you want to download. So that's stuff that you'd only use as a last resort. And then thirdly, you've got real-time data. So these are the scenes that come straight off of the satellite. So they're not processed to the same level as Tier 1. And you would only download them if you absolutely have to see the very latest data straight away. I think this is becoming a bit redundant because the processing times are speeding up anyway. And so scenes are finding their way into Tier 1 level within a few days regardless. So for me, that real-time tier is perhaps not as important as it used to be in the past. So we're looking for Collection 2 data, we're looking for Tier 1 data. So the third thing is the levels. Now there's level 1. I think actually it's fair to say there's level 0, which you can't access, but the USGS has access to. Then there's level 1, then level 2, then there's the United States analysis ready data, and then there's level 3. And generally speaking, one level will be derived from the previous level. So level 0 would be your raw data, gets processed by the USGS, and is produced, and it produces level 1. So level 1 is where you get started. That's the data that comes off of the satellite at its sort of base level. Beyond that, you go to more and more higher levels of processing. So in level 1, you get what are called digital numbers. So they're delivered to you. They don't have any units, they're not radiance, they're not reflectance, they're just numbers. And then you need to process that data in order to get it into some usable form. Level 2 has been processed to what's called surface reflectance and surface temperature. So this is the data that you're probably going to want, ultimately. But just interesting to point out that they don't include, so when you download a scene, you don't get all of the data from the previous level automatically. So for example, level 1 has the panchromatic band in it, but level 2 doesn't. So if you want panchromatic sharpening, you need to download the level 1 data and the level 2 data. Now, the analysis ready data is only for the United States. And rather than being shipped by scene, this is then repackaged into square tiles. So it's a completely kind of different format to the scenes that you find in level 1 and level 2. And then it's basically just a repackaging of that level 2 data. And then the level 3 data are the science products. And some of those are derived, or most of them are derived from the analysis ready data, but some are also derived from the level 2 data, so they might be in a tile format or they might be in a scene format. So all of that is fairly confusing, and you've got to work your way through it to figure out exactly what you want to download in order to achieve the task that you're trying to achieve. So you'll hear about radiance and you'll hear about reflectance. So what is the difference between these things? Well, radiance is what is measured by the instrument. And it includes all the light seen by the instrument, and it has units. So the radiance depends upon the illumination of the Earth at that time. So it depends on where the sun is and the angle of the terrain and aspect and ratio and so forth. Then reflectance is a ratio. And it doesn't have any units because it's a ratio. It's the ratio of the amount of light leaving a target to the amount of light that's striking the target. So it depends only on the properties of the observed object. Now, we don't measure reflectance. Reflectance is something that we have to compute by applying all sorts of corrections. So we can't generate perfect reflectance data, but of course we work hard to achieve the best possible result that we can through all the corrections that we do. Okay, so what kind of stuff gets delivered? What are the units of all these things? So if you get level 1 data, you'll get digital numbers. As I mentioned before, they don't have any units. And people say, well, what are the digital numbers? Well, they're just numbers. That's all they are. They're not radiance. They're not reflectance. But through simple transformations, they can be turned into radiance and reflectance. Anyway, so they're just numbers. They have no units and scaled between what? They're 16-bit numbers, scaled up to 65,535. Then you can apply some simple corrections to compute either radiance from those digital numbers or reflectance from those digital numbers. And this is termed top of atmosphere spectral radiance and top of atmosphere reflectance. And from the TIERS instruments, you can compute top of atmosphere brightness temperature. So this doesn't correct for the atmosphere. The atmosphere is still in the radiance and reflectance data. And for example, your blue channel, you'll probably get more blue light from the atmosphere than you'll get from reflected from the ground. But this is sort of the first level of processing, to go from digital numbers to go to these top of atmosphere measures. Then a second level of processing, and a far more complicated level of processing, is to go from top of atmosphere to then remove the atmosphere contribution and go to surface or bottom of atmosphere. So then you've got your surface reflectance and your surface temperature. So your surface reflectance is your best measure of reflectance. So it's also highly corrected. So whether or not it's the best data to use is another question. So that's something that we'll look at in the next few slides. But generally speaking, that's the bee's knees: surface reflectance and surface temperature, and they're what you want to use for doing your processing. So just a bit of a word on corrections that get applied. So firstly, there's all sorts of geometric corrections. You've got your georeferencing and orthorectifying, and there's terrain corrections. Now that's all performed by the USGS in order to get from level 0 up to level 1, which they then deliver to you. Then you've got your solar corrections, which include your top of atmosphere, radiance and reflectance calculations, which you can perform. And then you have your atmosphere correction, and I think combined with a topographic correction, which computes corrections for the slope of for example, if you're looking at a slope, it will be either in shadow or in the sun, and so there'll be a brightness difference depending on the slope. So there's corrections for that, and removing those atmospheric corrections, that gives you then your surface reflectance, which of course is your key measure. And then when you're looking at multiple scenes, you can also perform a relative correction. And this will bring each band in your scene to the same radiometric scale as some reference scene. And for example, you can use things like histogram matching to achieve that kind of relative correction. So just looking at that visually, again, I've nicked this from that paper. So you have your instrument here measuring electromagnetic energy. And this is our processing scale here, inverse processing scale. So the further down we go, the more processing we have to do. So at the top we have our digital numbers, which you get delivered in level 1. Then we can convert that using a simple transform, just a linear transform to radiance. And this is a top of atmosphere radiance. And that can also be converted to top of atmosphere reflectance, brightness temperature. This applies your thermal calibration and your solar correction. And again, this is a fairly simple computation. And then at the surface, once we've applied our atmospheric correction and I think our topographic correction, then we get our surface reflectance and surface temperature. Right, so you've got all those possible inputs and all those possible outputs. What do you want to use? What should we use? Well, it kind of depends on what you want to produce. So, do you want to produce red, green, blue rendering? Which, of course, you'll do in ProRaster Scientific. So there's all sorts of different combinations of Landsat bands that you can choose for your RGB, and the colours highlight different aspects of the Earth. So that's fine. You can use digital numbers for red, green, blue rendering because you're going to apply a transform to each of those bands, and they can be different per band. So perhaps digital numbers is perfectly suitable for that. But what if you're using multiple scenes in a mosaic? Well, then you're going to want to have something that's more consistent across scenes. So you're probably going to want to look at surface reflectance instead of digital numbers. What if you have a scene that's been collected, every 16 days by the instrument or every 8 days by 2 different instruments, and so you have a temporal stack of these scenes, and you want to see how this scene has changed through time. Well, again, then you're going to want to have your data consistent from one scene to the next, and so you're probably going to want a higher level of processing than digital numbers. Same with a temporal mosaic. And of course, you can also apply your pan sharpening to your RGB rendering, so that's another thing to be considered. You can produce indices. So these are usually some fairly simple formula, usually some ratio of bands. So for example, you've got the NDVI vegetation index, which for Landsat 8 would be band 5 minus 4 on band 5 plus 4. So just a simple formula, and ProRaster will compute these things for you in virtual rasters. So what kind of input will you require to this index calculation? Well, again, it depends on whether you're looking at one scene or multiple scenes in a mosaic or temporal scenes. It also depends on the index itself. Some of these formulas expect that the data is in some particular units and perhaps over some particular range. Others don't. For example, the NDVI, you can see it doesn't really matter what the units of the inputs would be to that formula because it's just a ratio. And it depends what you want to do with that index, whether you just want to compute it or render it, or whether you want to do statistical analysis of that index, in which case it's important that it's consistent from one place to the next. And then there are other things that you can produce, like specific values, like surface albedo, for example. You can do classification, for example, for land use, and correlative models. So, again, I've nicked this from the paper, so you have this sort of decision tree. And so you look at what you need. Say, do I need specific units? For example, for the index that I want to calculate. Well, yes, okay, we've got to go one particular way. If no, okay, we keep going. Are you analysing spectral values within a single scene, or is it, mosaic, or is it multiple series of time? Well then, okay, we can use digital number if it's a single scene. Otherwise, no, we need to keep going. Are you analysing across across multiple scenes or multiple times or both? Well, yes, we're going to need surface reflectance. So that little picture kind of helps you make the decisions about what you're going to need. So I'll just bring up ProRaster here. So I just want to show you something. On the issue of Landsat 9, I've only downloaded a few scenes, but so here's a level 1 scene, and this is true color. So you can see we've got red, green, blue, bands 4, 3, and 2. And you can see in this image that there's some cloud. So this is digital numbers. There's no corrections applied to this. The lake down here. And then if you go to the surface reflectance for that same scene, and there it is there, you can see that there's some nasty things. So these clouds have been turned into these splodges. And actually they're kind of everywhere. Down here as well. And then down here at this lake, I thought this was interesting. There's this kind of green band through this lake. And if you go back to the digital number data, there's really no evidence of that whatsoever. So I just wanted to show you that to illustrate the fact that perhaps Landsat 9 is not quite ready. They're still doing their calibrations. Perhaps they're still improving their processing operations. As I said, they're going to redo all the processing at the end of 2022. So here in mid-2022, on the basis of these sorts of artifacts, I think you'd have to say that Landsat 8 is a better bet at the present time than Landsat 9. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope that helps you come to grips with Landsat pre-processing.